A struggling waitress dared to criticize a millionaire's business strategy. The next day, his private jet landed at her doorstep. Before we begin, comment below with the city you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The cafe was alive with its usual chaos. Murmurs of conversations blending with the hiss of the espresso machine and the occasional clatter of plates. Emily Jacobs adjusted her apron for the third time that morning, trying to shake off the exhaustion that clung to her like a heavy coat. Another double shift. Another day where she'd barely scrape by enough for rent. The dreams she once had of doing something meaningful, something extraordinary, felt like distant echoes in a life overtaken by survival. Her manager's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Table 6, Emily. And be quick about it." She glanced over at the table and hesitated. The man seated there didn't look like the cafe's usual clientele. His tailored gray suit fit him like it was custom-made, which it probably was, and his watch glinted under the fluorescent lights, the kind that screamed luxury. He was hunched over his phone, scrolling furiously, his jaw tight with irritation. Emily grabbed her notepad and forced a polite smile onto her face as she approached. "Good morning, sir. Can I get you started with something?" The man barely looked up. "Black coffee. No sugar." His voice was clipped, dismissive. "Of course," Emily replied, her tone calm despite the flash of annoyance she felt. She turned to head toward the counter, but caught the faintest mutter under his breath. Another disaster. What else is new? Curiosity sparked in her, but she brushed it aside. Rich people and their problems, she thought to herself, preparing his coffee. As she set the cup down in front of him minutes later, she noticed his phone buzz with yet another notification. He glanced at the screen and sighed audibly, rubbing his temples. "Sounds like a tough day," she said before she could stop herself. It wasn't like her to make small talk with customers, especially not ones like him. He looked up sharply, his eyes piercing as they met hers for the first time. For a moment, she thought he might snap at her, but instead, he let out a dry laugh. "That's one way to put it." Emily hesitated. Something about the weariness in his expression felt strangely human. She set her tray on the table beside her and took a small risk. "You know, sometimes it helps to talk about it, and sometimes it helps to hear it from someone who isn't trying to impress you." His brow furrowed, as if trying to decide whether her interruption was bold or foolish. Finally, he gestured to the seat across from him. "All right, humor me. Imagine you're running a business, a big one. Sales are tanking, customers are leaving, and the competition is circling like sharks. What would you do?" Emily blinked, surprised by his candor. She slid into the chair cautiously, feeling the weight of his question. "Well," she began, choosing her words carefully, "I'd start by looking at the basics. Why are customers leaving? What's changed? It's easy to blame competitors, but sometimes the real problem is closer to home." His eyes narrowed slightly, but not in anger. "Closer to home, huh?" She nodded, leaning forward. "Think about it. When was the last time you walked into one of your own stores and saw it through a customer's eyes? Or talked to the people on the ground, the ones who actually interact with customers every day?" For a moment he didn't respond, his gaze fixed on her as if she were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. Then his phone buzzed again, pulling him back to reality. He glanced at the screen and sighed. "I have to go," he said abruptly, standing and pulling out his wallet. He tossed a crisp $100 bill onto the table, far more than the cost of his coffee. "Thanks for the coffee," he said, pausing for a moment. "And for the unsolicited advice." Emily watched as he strode out of the cafe, his phone pressed to his ear before he even reached the door. The encounter left her feeling oddly unsettled. She wasn't sure if she'd said too much or if her words had actually struck a nerve. Either way, she doubted she'd ever see him again. Later that night, as she cleaned up the cafe after closing, her thoughts drifted back to the stranger at table 6. There was something about him, something beyond the tailored suit and the air of importance. He had seemed lost in a way she hadn't expected. Meanwhile, in the back seat of his sleek black car, Lucas Harrington stared out at the city lights, her words replaying in his mind. When was the last time you saw your business through your customer's eyes? It was such a simple question, but it gnawed at him. He had spent years building his empire, expanding faster than anyone thought possible. But had he lost sight of what mattered along the way? As the car pulled into his penthouse driveway, Lucas resolved to find out. Little did Emily know, her casual comment had planted a seed that would soon grow into something neither of them could have imagined. Rain pattered against the wide windows of Lucas Harrington's penthouse office, blurring the city skyline into a canvas of shimmering lights. He sat at his desk, a half-empty tumbler of scotch beside him, staring at the glowing screen of his laptop. The numbers didn't lie, and they weren't kind. Lucas scrolled through the latest reports, his jaw tightening with every line. Sales were down another 12%. Customer retention had dropped below industry standards. Even his flagship stores, once the crown jewels of his empire, were underperforming. The competition wasn't just catching up, they were outpacing him. Her voice echoed in his mind. When was the last time you saw your business through your customer's eyes? It was ridiculous, really. A waitress, someone who likely earned less in a month than he spent on a single dinner, had somehow gotten under his skin. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He could dismiss her words as nothing more than idle chatter, but deep down he couldn't. There was a nagging truth in what she'd said, one he couldn't ignore any longer. The next morning, Lucas made a decision he hadn't made in years. Instead of heading to his usual boardroom meetings and delegating tasks, he canceled his schedule and drove himself to one of his stores. He didn't inform anyone, not the managers, not his assistants. If he was going to see what was wrong, he needed to see it as it truly was. The store was one of his largest, situated in the heart of a bustling shopping district. From the outside, it looked immaculate, polished windows, sleek signage, and a steady flow of customers. But the moment Lucas stepped inside, he felt it. Something was off. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glare over the rows of shelves, many of which were haphazardly stocked. Employees loitered near the registers, chatting among themselves, barely acknowledging the customers wandering the aisles. A woman near the entrance was struggling to find something on the top shelf, and no one offered to help. Lucas walked slowly through the store, observing everything. He noticed a young mother balancing a toddler on her hip while scanning a cluttered display, her frustration palpable. Another customer picked up a product, examined it for a moment, then sat down with a frown and walked out. He approached one of the employees, a teenage boy who seemed more interested in his phone than the people around him. "Excuse me," Lucas said, keeping his tone neutral. "Can you tell me where I can find the travel section?" The boy barely looked up, gesturing vaguely toward the back. "Over there, I think." "Thanks," Lucas replied, biting back his irritation. As he moved deeper into the store, the picture became clearer. It wasn't just the layout or the staffing. It was the atmosphere. The energy that had once defined his brand, the sense of care and connection that customers had come to expect, was gone. By the time he left, Lucas had pages of notes on his phone, a mix of observations and questions. But one thing was clear: his company was broken, and it wasn't going to fix itself. That evening, Lucas sat in his office once more, sifting through years of decisions that had led to this moment. He had trusted his team, his advisors, and the metrics that painted a picture of progress. But he had stopped trusting his instincts. He had stopped looking at the bigger picture. And then there was Emily. Her face flashed in his mind, the tired but sharp-eyed waitress who had dared to speak to him with a confidence that had surprised him. He remembered her exact words, the way she had leaned forward slightly, her tone steady yet curious. "When was the last time you walked into one of your own stores and saw it through a customer's eyes?" For the first time in years, Lucas felt something he couldn't quite name. Was it embarrassment? or perhaps a begrudging respect for someone who had no stake in his world but had seen its flaws more clearly than anyone in his inner circle ever had. The next morning, he picked up the phone and called his assistant. "Find her," he said simply. "Find who, sir?" "The waitress," he replied. "From the cafe. I need to talk to her again." His assistant hesitated for a moment, clearly confused. "I'll look into it, sir. Do you know her name?" Lucas paused. He realized he didn't even know her last name. "Her first name is Emily," he said finally. "Start there." The assistant nodded, though her uncertainty was evident. Lucas hung up the phone and stared out at the city skyline once more. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Unbeknownst to Emily, her casual comment had set off a chain of events that would soon pull her into a world far beyond the confines of her cafe. Emily was halfway through her shift when the first sign of trouble appeared. A sleek black car rolled up to the curb outside the cafe, its polished exterior gleaming under the midday sun. Emily barely noticed it at first, too preoccupied with balancing an overloaded tray of dishes and coffee mugs. But when the driver stepped out, a tall man in a sharp suit with an air of purpose, she couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease. "Who drives a car like that here?" muttered one of her co-workers, peering out the window. "Looks like he's about to buy the whole block." Emily chuckled lightly, dismissing the comment, but her stomach twisted when the man entered the cafe and scanned the room with precise intent. His gaze landed on her almost immediately. "Emily Jacobs." His voice was calm, professional, but carried an undeniable weight. Emily froze, the tray wobbling slightly in her hands. Yeah, that's me," she said cautiously. "Can I help you?" The man walked toward her, handing her a small, cream-colored envelope with her name printed in elegant script on the front. "Mr. Harrington would like to meet with you. Transportation has been arranged." Her confusion must have been obvious because the man offered her a polite but firm nod. "The details are in the envelope. Please be ready at the specified time." Without another word, he turned and exited the cafe, leaving Emily holding the envelope like it might explode. Her co-worker nudged her with wide eyes. "Who the hell is Mr. Harrington?" Emily barely heard the question. She retreated to the back room, away from the curious stares of customers and staff, and tore open the envelope. Inside was a thick card with embossed lettering. "Dear Emily, your insight was invaluable. I'd like to discuss it further. Please meet me at the following address at 7 p.m. Transportation will be provided. Sincerely, Lucas Harrington." Her heart raced. Lucas Harrington. The name clicked instantly. The man from table 6. The millionaire. She stared at the note, her mind a whirlwind of questions. What could he possibly want from her? That evening, Emily found herself in the back seat of the same sleek black car that had delivered the envelope. Her fingers fidgeted with the strap of her bag as she stared out the window, the city lights blurring into streaks of gold and red. The driver was polite but silent, leaving her alone with her nerves. The car pulled up in front of a towering glass building, its modern design a stark contrast to the cozy, worn-down cafe where she spent her days. Emily stepped out cautiously, her heels clicking on the marble floor of the lobby as she followed the receptionist's directions to the top floor. When the elevator doors opened, she found herself in an office that could only belong to someone like Lucas Harrington. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city skyline, and minimalist furniture exuded an understated elegance. Lucas was already waiting, his expression unreadable as he approached her. "Emily," he said, extending his hand, "thank you for coming." She hesitated for a fraction of a second before shaking it. "I'm still not sure why I'm here," she admitted, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. Lucas smiled faintly and gestured for her to sit. "I imagine you have questions. Let me explain." As he spoke, he outlined the challenges his company was facing. declining sales, waning customer loyalty, and a growing disconnect between the brand's image and its reality. "Your comment at the cafe stuck with me," he admitted. "You saw something my entire team missed. That kind of perspective is rare, and I'd like to hear more of it." Emily blinked, stunned. "You're asking me for advice?" "Yes," Lucas replied simply. "And I'm willing to compensate you for your time. Help me understand what we're doing wrong and how we can fix it." Her initial reaction was to laugh. Surely this was some elaborate joke, but the sincerity in his tone and the weight in his gaze silenced her doubts. Still, she couldn't shake her skepticism. "I'm just a waitress," she said finally. "What makes you think I can help with something this big?" Lucas leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. Sometimes, the people closest to a problem are the least equipped to see it. You're an outsider with nothing to lose. That's exactly why your perspective is so valuable. Emily's mind raced. Part of her wanted to walk out and pretend this conversation had never happened. But another part, the part that had always dreamed of something more, felt a flicker of excitement. What would this job entail? She asked cautiously. "For now, observation," Lucas said. "Visit my stores, speak to employees, see what customers see. Tell me what you find, and if I say no, then I'll thank you for your time and let you go back to your life," Lucas replied, his tone even. "But something tells me you won't say no." Emily stared at him, weighing her options. This was insane, completely out of her depth. And yet, when was the last time anyone had believed she could do something extraordinary? "All right," she said finally, her voice firmer than she expected. "I'll do it, but I can't promise you'll like what I have to say." Lucas's smile widened, a rare warmth breaking through his usually stoic demeanor. "That's exactly what I'm counting on." As Emily left the building that night, her head swirled with thoughts. She had no idea what she was walking into, but for the first time in years, she felt like she was on the brink of something big, something that might just change her life forever. Emily stepped out of the car, her sneakers crunching against the gravel of the parking lot. The storefront in front of her was sleek, modern, and deceptively inviting. From the outside, it looked like everything was running smoothly, a beacon of success that Lucas Harrington had built over years of relentless ambition. But Emily knew better now. This was her first day on the job, if she could even call it that. She wasn't wearing the corporate attire Lucas had suggested, choosing instead her comfortable jeans and a sweater, blending in with the average customer. Her goal was to observe, not intimidate, and she needed the employees to treat her like anyone else. She took a deep breath and pushed through the glass doors. Inside, the atmosphere was noticeably different from the polished exterior. The store was cold, clinical, with harsh fluorescent lighting that made everything feel sterile. Employees moved listlessly, their eyes glued to the clock rather than the customers. A faint buzz of irritation hung in the air, and it didn't take long for Emily to notice why. A young mother wrestled with a crying toddler near the entrance, scanning the shelves with a look of growing frustration. "Excuse me," she called out to a passing employee. "Do you know where I can find the travel section?" The employee, a teenage girl wearing an oversized name tag, barely slowed her pace. It's somewhere in the back," she mumbled before disappearing into another aisle. Emily winced at the exchange and made her way deeper into the store. She passed by an elderly couple who seemed overwhelmed by the sheer number of disorganized products crammed onto the shelves. Another customer stood near the checkout counter, tapping his foot impatiently as the cashier chatted with a coworker instead of ringing up his purchase. By the time she reached the far corner of the store, Emily's notepad was already half filled with notes. It was a mess, a far cry from the polished image Lucas's brand projected in its advertisements. She decided to test the waters and approached an employee near the electronics section. A young man slouched over his phone. "Hi," she said with a friendly smile. "I'm trying to find a power adapter for my laptop. Can you help me?" The employee glanced up briefly before returning to his phone. Yeah, they're over there somewhere," he said, waving vaguely toward a shelf on the other side of the aisle. "Thanks," Emily replied, though her tone carried a hint of sarcasm. She found the adapters on her own and made a note of the interaction. It wasn't just one bad employee. It was a culture. The staff seemed disengaged, the customers frustrated, and the store itself felt more like a warehouse than a welcoming shopping experience. After spending nearly 3 hours observing, Emily left the store with pages of notes and a sinking feeling in her stomach. She had expected to find issues, but this was worse than she had imagined. It wasn't just a problem of organization or customer service. It was systemic. That evening, she sat across from Lucas in his sprawling office, her notepad clutched tightly in her hands. He studied her expectantly, his sharp features unreadable as always. "So," he said, leaning back in his chair, "what did you see?" Emily took a deep breath. "It's bad," she began bluntly. "How bad?" Lucas asked, his tone calm but laced with curiosity. "Bad enough that I'm surprised you still have customers," she replied, meeting his gaze. "The staff is disengaged, the layout is confusing, and the overall atmosphere feels cold. People walk in expecting one thing and leave feeling disappointed." Lucas frowned, his brow furrowing as he absorbed her words. "And what do you think is causing it?" Emily hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "It's not just one thing, it's everything. The employees aren't motivated because they don't feel valued. The customers are frustrated because they don't feel heard. And honestly, the stores don't feel like they're part of a bigger vision anymore. They're just there." Lucas nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "And how would you fix it?" Emily felt her palms grow clammy. She wasn't used to being put on the spot like this, but she forced herself to speak. "Start with the employees," she said firmly. "They're the ones who interact with customers every day. If they're unhappy, it shows. Pay them better, train them better, and listen to what they have to say. Then work on the customer experience. Simplify the layout, make it easier for people to find what they're looking for, and create an atmosphere that feels welcoming." For a moment, Lucas didn't respond. He tapped his fingers against the desk, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere behind her. Then he leaned forward, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You're not holding back, are you?" "I don't see the point," Emily replied with a shrug. "You didn't bring me here to sugarcoat things." Lucas chuckled, the sound surprisingly warm. "Fair enough. I'll take your recommendations under advisement." Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had half expected him to dismiss her entirely, but instead, he seemed genuinely interested in what she had to say. As she left his office that night, her notepad tucked under her arm, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. She had stepped into a world she barely understood, but for the first time in years, she felt like she was part of something bigger than herself. The days that followed felt like a whirlwind to Emily. Lucas hadn't just taken her recommendations under advisement, he had acted on them immediately. That same evening, an email went out to all store managers, instructing them to prepare for an internal audit unlike anything they'd seen before. What Lucas didn't mention was that the audit wasn't coming from seasoned consultants or high-level executives. It was coming from her. Emily's first assignment was daunting. Visit 3 more stores in different parts of the city, identify key problem areas, and draft a comprehensive report by the end of the week. She couldn't help but feel like she was in way over her head. She was just a waitress, after all. Or at least, that's how she still saw herself. Her first stop was a suburban store that catered to families. The parking lot was packed, but the chaos inside made it clear why. Shelves were poorly stocked, customers jostled for space in narrow aisles, and the checkout line stretched so far back it nearly reached the entrance. Emily observed quietly, jotting down notes on her clipboard. She noticed a young father trying to juggle a cart full of groceries and a fussy toddler. "Excuse me," he called to a passing employee. "Do you know where I can find baby formula?" The employee, a middle-aged man with a weary expression, sighed audibly before gesturing vaguely toward the back. "It should be somewhere in aisle 12, he said, his tone making it clear he didn't want to be bothered further. Emily frowned. This wasn't just bad customer service. It was a symptom of a larger issue. She approached the man after the father had walked away. "Rough day?" she asked, her voice light but curious. The employee looked at her, surprised by her friendly tone. "Every day's rough," he replied, shrugging. "We're short-staffed, underpaid, and expected to do the work of 3 people. Customers get mad at us. But what can we do?" Emily nodded, jotting down his comments. She spent the next hour speaking to more employees, listening to their grievances. By the time she left, her notepad was filled with stories of frustration and burnout, but also glimmers of hope. Ideas from employees who genuinely wanted to make the store better if given the chance. Her next stop was a smaller location in the heart of the city. The atmosphere here was slightly different, but the issues were just as glaring. The store was disorganized, the staff seemed disengaged, and the customers looked more annoyed than satisfied. At one point, Emily noticed a woman at the checkout counter arguing with the cashier. "I've been waiting for 20 minutes, the woman said, her voice rising. "And now you're telling me you don't even have the product I came here for." The cashier, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 19, looked close to tears. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she stammered. I don't handle inventory." Emily stepped in, her voice calm but firm. "Ma'am, I understand your frustration. Let me see if there's someone who can help." She turned to the cashier, who looked at her gratefully, and added softly, "It's not your fault." The incident stayed with her as she finished her observations for the day. It wasn't just the customers who were struggling. The employees were clearly bearing the brunt of poor management and inadequate resources. When Emily presented her findings to Lucas later that week, she didn't hold back. She laid out everything she'd seen: the disorganization, the disengaged staff, the frustrated customers. But she also highlighted the potential. "Your employees want to do better," she said, her voice steady despite the nerves bubbling beneath the surface. "They're not the problem, they're the solution. But they need support. Better training, better pay, and a reason to care about this company again." Lucas listened intently, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, letting out a long breath. "You're telling me it's not just about fixing the stores, it's about fixing the culture?" "Exactly," Emily replied. "And it starts from the top. If the leadership doesn't care, why would anyone else?" For a moment, silence filled the room. Emily wondered if she'd overstepped, but Lucas finally nodded. "All right," he said, his voice resolute. "We'll start with the training program. I'll authorize raises for staff at all levels, and we'll create a system for employee feedback. But I want you to oversee the rollout." Her eyes widened. "Me? I don't know anything about corporate policies or training programs." "You know what the stores need," Lucas countered. "That's more than most people in this company can say." "You've earned this, Emily." She felt a lump form in her throat. For years, she had worked jobs where her voice didn't matter, where she was just another cog in the machine. And now, here she was, being given the kind of responsibility she'd never thought possible. "I'll do it," she said finally, her voice steady. As she left his office that evening, a sense of purpose settled over her. This wasn't just a job. It was an opportunity to make a real difference. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was building something new, both for herself and for the people who had been overlooked for far too long. Emily woke up earlier than usual, the weight of her growing responsibilities pressing on her chest. The past few weeks had been a blur of store visits, employee interviews, and late-night strategy sessions. Despite her initial doubts, she was beginning to feel a sense of rhythm, a strange, exhilarating balance between the chaos and her newfound purpose. Today, however, was different. Lucas had invited her to attend a high-stakes meeting with the senior leadership team. She had spent hours preparing, going over her notes and crafting a presentation that would outline the steps needed to fix the company's crumbling culture. But as she entered the towering office building, her nerves hit full force. The conference room was already buzzing with activity. Executives in sharp suits sat around a polished glass table, laptops and notepads at the ready. Emily hesitated at the door, gripping the strap of her bag tightly. She wasn't like these people. She didn't belong here, or at least, that's what her inner voice kept insisting. Lucas noticed her immediately and waved her over. "Emily, come in. Take a seat." She nodded, forcing a polite smile as she sat beside him. Her presence drew curious glances from several of the executives, some of whom whispered to each other. She tried to ignore the sinking feeling in her stomach. "Thank you all for coming," Lucas began, his voice steady and authoritative. "Today, we're going to discuss the results of a comprehensive review of our stores. Emily Jacobs has been leading this effort, and I've invited her here to share her findings." The room fell silent, and all eyes turned to her. Emily felt her cheeks flush, but she steadied herself. She had worked too hard to let fear hold her back now. She stood, her hands trembling slightly as she clicked through the first slide of her presentation. "Good morning," she began, her voice wavering before she found her footing. "Over the past few weeks, I've visited multiple stores, spoken with employees and customers, and observed the challenges we're facing firsthand. The results are concerning." She clicked to the next slide, showing a chart of declining customer satisfaction scores. Customers feel disconnected from the brand. They're frustrated by disorganized layouts, unhelpful staff, and a lack of the personal touch that used to define this company. The room murmured, but Emily pressed on. "But this isn't just a customer issue. It's an employee issue. The staff feels undervalued, overworked, and unsupported. One employee told me, 'We're treated like numbers, not people.' That sentiment is echoed across every location I've visited." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Lucas nodded, his expression unreadable but attentive. "And yet," Emily continued, her voice growing stronger, "there's hope. Your employees want to do better. They have ideas, passion, and a desire to improve. But they need leadership that listens. They need resources, training, and recognition for their efforts. If we invest in them, they'll invest in this company." She ended her presentation with a list of recommendations: better pay, comprehensive training programs, regular feedback sessions, and an overhaul of store layouts to improve customer flow. When she finished, the room was silent. She couldn't tell if the executives were impressed or unimpressed, and the uncertainty gnawed at her. Finally, one man spoke up, his tone skeptical. "This is all well and good, but let's be realistic. These changes will cost millions. What's the guarantee that we'll see a return on investment?" Emily turned to him, her pulse quickening. "There's no guarantee," she admitted, her voice calm but firm. "But what I can guarantee is that doing nothing will cost you even more. Your brand is losing trust. Once that's gone, it's nearly impossible to get back. Investing in your people is investing in your future." The man opened his mouth to argue, but Lucas cut him off. "She's right," he said, his voice steady. "If we don't fix this now, we won't have a company left to save." Another executive chimed in, this time a woman with a thoughtful expression. "I think Emily's recommendations make sense. We've been so focused on short-term profits that we've lost sight of the bigger picture." Lucas nodded. "Exactly. And that ends today. We're implementing these changes immediately. Emily will oversee the rollout with my full support." The murmurs in the room grew louder, but Lucas raised a hand, silencing them. "This isn't up for debate. If anyone has a problem with it, my door is open. But make no mistake, this is happening." Emily sat back down, her heart racing. She couldn't believe what had just happened. Lucas had defended her, backed her ideas, and trusted her to lead a massive cultural shift. After the meeting, Lucas pulled her aside. "You did great in there," he said, his tone warm but serious. "Not everyone is going to like these changes, but that's not your problem. Keep doing what you're doing." Emily nodded, a mixture of pride and anxiety swirling in her chest. She had stepped into a world she barely understood, but for the first time, she felt like she was holding her own. As she left the office that day, she couldn't help but feel a growing sense of possibility. This wasn't just about fixing a company. It was about proving to herself that she was capable of more than she ever imagined. Emily stood in the middle of the largest flagship store in Lucas Harrington's empire, her clipboard clutched tightly in one hand and a pen nervously tapping against its edge. The stakes had never felt higher. This location was the centerpiece of Lucas's brand, the heart of his retail chain, and today it would serve as the testing ground for the sweeping changes she had proposed. The air buzzed with anticipation. Employees, regional managers, and even a few executives were present, observing every detail as the newly implemented policies came to life. Shelves had been reorganized with clearer signage and brighter, more welcoming lighting. A new, dedicated customer service desk sat near the entrance, staffed by some of the store's most personable employees. Most importantly, Emily had insisted on additional training for the staff, which she personally helped oversee. The team wasn't just told what to do. They were shown how to engage with customers, solve problems proactively, and work as a cohesive unit. She knew it wasn't perfect, but it was a start. The first test came almost immediately. A frazzled woman walked into the store, her two children tugging at her hands. Emily watched as the woman approached an employee stationed at the front. "Hi," the woman said, sounding overwhelmed. "I'm looking for school supplies, but I don't have a lot of time. Can you help me find what I need quickly?" The employee, a young man named Alex, who had been skeptical of the changes at first, smiled warmly. "Of course," he said. "School supplies are in aisle 5. I can take you there and help you pick out what you need." Emily's heart swelled as she watched Alex guide the woman and her children down the aisle, patiently answering her questions and even suggesting some money-saving options. By the time the woman left, her bags full and her kids smiling, Emily knew they had passed the first hurdle. As the day progressed, Emily moved through the store, observing interactions, asking employees how they felt about the changes, and taking notes. For the first time, she saw staff who seemed genuinely engaged, customers who looked pleased instead of frustrated, and a store that finally felt alive again. But the real test came in the form of an unexpected visit. Around mid-afternoon, a man walked in wearing a stern expression and a suit that screamed corporate. Emily recognized him immediately, Martin Greer, one of Lucas's most vocal critics on the executive team. Martin had been skeptical of Emily from the beginning, dismissing her as an amateur with no place in the company's leadership. He hadn't hesitated to voice his doubts during meetings, questioning Lucas's judgment in putting so much trust in her. Emily watched as Martin made his way through the store, his sharp eyes scanning every detail. She resisted the urge to approach him immediately, instead giving him space to observe on his own. After about 20 minutes, Martin approached her near the customer service desk. "Ms. Jacobs," he said, his tone formal but not unkind. "Mr. Greer," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "I've been watching," he said, crossing his arms. "I'll admit, the improvements are noticeable. The staff seems more engaged, and the customers appear to be responding positively. But what about the long term? Do you really think these changes will stick?" Emily met his gaze, refusing to let his skepticism rattle her. "I do," she said confidently, "because this isn't just about policies or procedures, it's about culture. We've started giving employees a reason to care again. And when they care, the customers feel it. That's not something that fades easily." Martin studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod. "We'll see," he said before walking away. The encounter left Emily feeling a mix of relief and determination. She knew not everyone would be convinced right away, but she also knew she was on the right track. As the day wound down, Lucas arrived to see the results for himself. He walked through the store with Emily, listening as she explained the changes and what she had observed. He spoke with employees, asked customers for feedback, and even helped restock a shelf to see how the new layout felt from the ground level. By the time they reached the exit, the sun setting outside, Lucas turned to Emily with a rare smile. "You've done something remarkable here," he said. "This store feels like it has a heartbeat again. That's because of you." Emily felt a lump in her throat, but managed to smile. "It's not just me," she said. "It's the employees, the customers, and, well, you, for giving me a chance." Lucas chuckled. "Don't get too sentimental on me, Emily. There's still a lot of work to do." "I wouldn't have it any other way," she replied. As she left the store that night, exhausted but exhilarated, Emily couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come. Just weeks ago, she had been serving coffee and struggling to make ends meet. Now, she was leading a transformation that was changing not just a company, but also herself. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt ready for whatever came next. The glow of the sunset painted the city skyline in hues of orange and pink as Emily sat at her small apartment table, staring at the untouched cup of tea in front of her. The day's events replayed in her mind like a whirlwind. Martin Greer's cautious acknowledgement, Lucas's rare praise, and the countless smiles from employees and customers alike. It felt surreal, like she had stepped into someone else's life. But as the initial euphoria wore off, doubt crept in. Could she sustain this momentum? What if it all fell apart? Emily shook her head, trying to dispel the negativity. She had come too far to let fear take over now. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Lucas. "Great work today. Tomorrow, we plan the next steps. Let's aim even higher." Emily smiled faintly, her chest tightening with a mix of pride and trepidation. Tomorrow. Always tomorrow. But tonight, she allowed herself to breathe. The next morning, she arrived at Lucas's office earlier than usual, determined to be prepared for whatever came next. To her surprise, he wasn't sitting behind his imposing desk. Instead, he was by the window, looking out over the city with a contemplative expression. "Good morning," Emily said cautiously, setting her bag down on a nearby chair. Lucas turned, his face softening when he saw her. "Morning. Come here for a second." She approached, standing beside him as he gestured to the bustling streets below. "Do you know what I see when I look out there?" he asked, his voice unusually reflective. Emily shook her head. "What?" "I see people, millions of them, each with their own struggles, their own stories," he said. "Some of them are walking into our stores right now, expecting us to make their lives just a little bit easier. And for a long time, I forgot that. I forgot what this was all supposed to be about." Emily listened quietly, the weight of his words sinking in. He turned to her, his expression serious but kind. "You reminded me, Emily. You showed me what I was too blind to see, and for that, I'm grateful." Before she could respond, Lucas gestured toward the table where 2 cups of coffee waited. "Let's talk about the future." They spent the next several hours mapping out plans for the company. Lucas wanted to expand the changes she had implemented at the Flagship store to all locations, but this time, Emily's role would be more hands-on. She would oversee the training programs, develop a system for gathering employee feedback, and work directly with store managers to ensure the new culture took root. It was overwhelming, to say the least. But as Lucas spoke, Emily felt a spark of excitement. She had always dreamed of doing something meaningful, something that mattered. And now, she had the chance. That afternoon, Lucas surprised her again. "There's one more thing I want to show you," he said, grabbing his coat. Emily followed him to his car, her curiosity piqued. They drove for nearly an hour, leaving the city behind and entering a quiet suburban neighborhood. Lucas pulled into the parking lot of an unassuming building with a "Coming Soon" sign out front. "What is this?" Emily asked as they stepped out. Lucas smiled. This is going to be our pilot training center, a place where employees can come to learn, grow, and connect with the company's mission. And I want you to lead it. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Lucas, I don't even know what to say. Say yes, he replied simply. She looked at the building, imagining the possibilities. A space where employees felt valued, where they could develop skills and build careers. It was exactly what the company and its people needed. I'm in, she said, her voice steady. The next few weeks were a blur of activity. Emily threw herself into the project, designing programs, recruiting trainers, and working tirelessly to bring the training center to life. Lucas gave her full autonomy, trusting her instincts every step of the way. On the day of the grand opening, Emily stood in front of a room filled with employees, managers, and even a few customers who had come to see the transformation for themselves. She felt a wave of nerves but pushed through it, stepping up to the podium with a confident smile. Welcome, she began, her voice carrying across the room. This center isn't just a place to learn. It's a symbol of what we can achieve together. It's a reminder that this company isn't just about products or profits. It's about people. The crowd erupted into applause, and Emily felt a swell of pride she hadn't experienced before. This wasn't just Lucas's success. It was hers, too. As the event wound down, Lucas approached her, a rare look of satisfaction on his face. You've done something incredible here, he said. Emily smiled. We've done something incredible. That night, as she sat alone in her apartment, Emily opened the notebook where she had scribbled dreams years ago. The pages were filled with ideas. A cafe she had wanted to open, a community center for underprivileged kids, and other ambitions she had long abandoned. For the first time, she didn't see them as impossible. She saw them as steps on a path she was finally walking. Lucas's company was thriving, and so was she. The waitress who had once doubted herself had become a leader, a visionary, and a force for change. And though the future remained uncertain, Emily knew one thing for sure. She was exactly where she was meant to be. And with that, we've reached the end of our story. Comment below and let us know which part you like the most. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like this video so you never miss our daily stories.